One crisp morning in 2013, a high schooler we'll call Duck was woken up by two strange men claiming to be police. He had argued with his parents the night before, a completely mundane fight about college choices and his preference for watching drum tutorials on YouTube. And now he was being dragged out to an unmarked car, totally unaware of where he was going. The men weren't police, they were private abductors. 30 minutes later, Duck was locked inside a high-security compound, surrounded by 3-meter walls and iron wire. He had just become the newest prisoner, in a nationwide war on youth, targeted specifically for having quote-unquote behavioral problems. To understand how a teenager gets kidnapped over a drum tutorial, we have to look back at early 2000s China. As the country grew wealthier, youth internet usage exploded. Teenagers flocked to 24-hour internet cafes, known as Wangba, to play games and escape intense academic pressure. For an older generation raised before the tech revolution, this obsession was terrifying. The generational panic reached a boiling point in 2008. The government officially declared internet addiction a clinical disorder, the first country in the world to do so. They gave it a name, Wang Yin. But this wasn't diagnosed by logging hours at a keyboard. The criteria for this new disease were shockingly broad. If a kid showed depression, argued with their parents, or dated someone they disapproved of, they could be labeled an internet addict. The diagnosis provided a medical excuse for a societal problem. By defining teenage rebellion as a clinical illness, China birthed a highly lucrative, entirely unregulated market. It was an industry built not to heal patients, but to enforce absolute, unquestioning filial obedience. The state-run media poured gasoline on the fire. Documentaries hit the airwaves, labeling online games like World of Warcraft as digital heroin, warning parents that the internet was turning their geniuses into beasts. Terrified parents needed a solution, and former Chinese army officers were ready to sell them one. They opened highly expensive boot camps, applying military-grade discipline to so-called addicted teens. Inside these walls, the reality was grim. Detainees were subjected to grueling forced marches and physical exhaustion. The food was terrible, hygiene was severely restricted, and anyone who stepped out of line risked being thrown into a solitary confinement cell for up to 10 days. But the physical punishment was only half the strategy. The psychological architecture of these camps was designed to turn the kids against each other. Guards explicitly encouraged senior detainees to physically bully and discipline the newer arrivals, ensuring the violence was self-sustaining. It was a brutal environment that rapidly manufactured Stockholm Syndrome. To survive, desperate teenagers had to compete for the guards' favor. Some inmates even resorted to giving the caretakers back massages just to secure a few extra scraps of food from the cafeteria. There was no therapy happening here. The military approach functioned entirely as a behavioral compliance engine. The goal was to systematically break a teenager's psychological resistance until they had no choice but to submit to authority. While the boot camps relied on brute force, another method gained immense popularity. A psychiatrist named Yang Yongxin, affectionately called Uncle Yang, pioneered what he promised was a medical cure, a technique he called brainwaking. Getting treated by Uncle Yang meant walking into a financial and legal trap. Parents were required to sign away their legal guardianship for the duration of the stay. They were billed nearly $900 a month, more than double the average Chinese salary at the time, with heavy financial penalties if they tried to pull their child out early. This chart shows standard electroconvulsive therapy. Patients are put under general anesthesia, and the shock lasts for just a few milliseconds. Uncle Yang didn't use anesthesia. In room 13, he fired skull-rattling electrical shocks into their brains for several minutes at a time. He attached electrodes to teenagers' hands and temples, inserting a mouthguard so they wouldn't bite off their own tongues. The pain was designed to be unbearable. Uncle Yang's medical credentials were a thin veil over state-sanctioned sadistic torture. The shocks would only stop when a teenager finally broke, admitted they were wrong, and offered a tearful apology to their parents. Eventually, the extreme violence of the industry spilled out into the open. Reports emerged of kids dying just days after arriving at these camps, their bodies covered in bruises. Some broken survivors sought desperate revenge, including a 16-year-old girl who tied her mother to a chair and starved her to death for sending her away. The survivors found a way to fight back, using the very tool they were supposedly addicted to. Victims took to the internet to detail the horrors of Room 13. The Chinese World of Warcraft community organized a massive digital outcry, spreading the stories until the mainstream media could no longer ignore them. Faced with massive public outrage, the government stepped in. In 2009, China officially banned the use of electroshock therapy for internet addiction. A few of the most notorious camp founders were jailed, and facilities were ordered to close. But the bans were essentially an illusion. Uncle Yang skirted the law by slightly tweaking his machines and rebranding the torture as electronic acupuncture, keeping Room 13 operational for years. Hundreds of other abusive camps simply changed their names and addresses, continuing to operate with the tacit knowledge of local party officials. The persistence of these camps reveals a dark truth. As long as society remains willing to view simple disobedience as a disease to be cured, the demand for these facilities will survive. And where there are desperate parents willing to pay, the infrastructure for this kind of organized abuse will never truly disappear.